What if everything I've ever believed about myself, every certainty, every identity, every story, was never truly mine to begin with? What if the I've been carrying like a sacred emblem was actually a costume stitched together by a world that never had my permission to shape me? I remember the first time this question confronted me, not gently but like a whisper that cuts through bone. It came to me in a moment when the chaos of the world felt louder than my own thoughts, when every headline, every opinion, every noise seemed to be telling me how to feel, how to think, how to exist, and suddenly I wondered whether I had ever genuinely met myself, or if I'd only met the version society built for me. That moment changed everything. Because once you begin to sense the illusion even faintly, you can never fully return to the comfort of ignorance. The world feels like a stage set built around you, elaborate, dazzling, seductive. But behind the shimmering lights, the props are cardboard, and the actors are reading from scripts that no one remembers writing. I began to ask myself who is running the play, who benefits from the roles we're forced into, and more importantly, when did I agree to participate? The uncomfortable truth I discovered is that the ego, the thing we cling to as our compass, was never entirely ours. It was shaped by the collective, by institutions disguised as benevolent guides, by narratives polished so clean we mistake them for truth. I started noticing how my thoughts felt pre-programmed, not by some sinister machine, but by centuries of human habit, by cultures that reward conformity and punish deviation, by systems that rely on predictability to maintain power. Everywhere I looked, I saw a river of ideas flowing through humanity, ideas repeated so often they had hardened into an unbreakable belief that we must fit into a pattern to belong. I saw this pattern everywhere, in advertisements telling me what happiness looks like, in news cycles feeding me ready-made fears, in educational structures teaching me what to think instead of how to think. And it struck me with a force almost psychedelic in its intensity. None of these voices asked for my permission. They simply entered my consciousness, rearranged the furniture, and called it identity. That's when I began peeling the layers slowly, carefully, almost like diffusing an ancient device. I realized that the ego I defended so fiercely was built from other people's expectations, societal pressures, borrowed definitions of success, second-hand dreams. I saw how deeply I had internalized them, and I felt a strange grief rising within me, a mourning for a self I had never truly allowed to exist. But beneath that grief, something else stirred, something wild, unfiltered, and shockingly alive. It was the faint pulse of my true self, buried under decades of accumulated illusions. The more I observed this inner landscape, the more the world outside began revealing its own cracks. The chaos I once thought was random began to look orchestrated. Not intentionally, not by some shadowy cabal, but through collective habit. Humanity has been hypnotized by its own stories, entranced by its own inventions. We've created machines, systems, hierarchies, and then convinced ourselves that we must obey them. We've built societies that reward performance over authenticity, noise over silence, certainty over inquiry. And in doing so, we've crafted an ego that isn't personal at all. It's a shared hallucination, passed from hand to hand until we forget it began as an idea. I found myself standing at the edge of this realization as if looking down into a canyon. It was terrifying because stepping forward meant abandoning the comfortable illusion that I understood my place in the world. But something inside me whispered, almost mischievously, what if freedom exists only beyond the edge? And so I stepped. The fall was not a collapse but an unmasking. I began to see how the ego operates like a prism, bending reality to fit its own narrative. It filters experiences, categorizes everything into mine and not mine, good and bad, possible and impossible. But as I questioned its authority, I realized the ego had no real substance. It was a projection, a story, a psychological survival strategy inherited from a society obsessed with labels and identities. And once I saw through it, even briefly, the world widened. The colors seemed sharper. The silence between thoughts became audible. I felt like I had stumbled into a secret room inside my own consciousness, a room where truth had been waiting patiently. In that room, I discovered something unexpected. Without the ego's grip, my perception became disturbingly honest. I saw how fear had shaped so many of my decisions, not because the world was dangerous, but because the ego thrives on threats. I saw how often I reacted instead of choosing, how often I mistook distraction for purpose, how deeply I relied on familiar narratives to make sense of uncertainty. And I realized that the chaos we see in the world is not merely external, it's the collective ego in panic. desperately clinging to old patterns as the world evolves faster than our stories can keep up. But something else became clear too. Chaos is not just destruction. Chaos is the birthplace of transformation. When the ego dissolves, even momentarily, the mind is given permission to perceive without distortion. It begins to sense patterns beneath the noise, whispers beneath the screaming narratives, opportunities beneath the apparent disorder. I learned that my true self, the one not assembled by society, was not fragile. It wasn't searching for approval. It wasn't afraid of uncertainty. It was grounded, curious, almost ancient. It wanted to experience reality directly, without the mediation of collective illusions. The more I leaned into this shift, the more my awareness sharpened. I started noticing how much of society is built around distraction, constant entertainment, constant stimulation, constant urgency. It's as if the world is terrified that we might sit still long enough to realize how deeply we've been conditioned. Because if we did, even for a moment, the entire illusion might unravel. And perhaps that's why genuine self-discovery feels rebellious. When I began questioning the narratives handed to me, I wasn't just breaking personal patterns. I was stepping outside the gravitational pull of the collective ego. And once you step outside, even slightly, you begin to see how much potential lies dormant within you. Not because you are special in the egotistical sense, but because every human carries an unfiltered core of awareness, an awareness that has been muted by cultural noise. I started listening to that core. It spoke in quiet intuitions, in subtle insights, in moments of clarity that felt almost extraterrestrial. It wasn't telling me who to be, it was showing me who I had always been before the world taught me to forget. As I followed this inner voice, the world around me transformed, not physically, but perceptually. I no longer felt as though I was navigating chaos. Instead, I felt like I was observing a species trapped in its own dream, yearning to wake up but terrified of what awakening requires. The collective ego is a cage disguised as safety, and once I saw the bars, I wanted nothing more than to step beyond them, not to escape humanity, but to rejoin it with new eyes, eyes capable of seeing truth without fear. And as this journey deepened, I realized something profound: the true self doesn't need to be constructed. It only needs to be uncovered. It is already there, beneath the layers, waiting for the courage to be revealed. The more I peeled away the egoic illusions, the more I felt a sense of liberation that defied language. It was not elation, not excitement, not even peace. It was a kind of inner spaciousness, a reclaimed territory of the mind that felt infinite. And yet, I knew this was only the beginning. The unraveling had started, but the deeper journey was still ahead. And yet, I knew this was only the beginning. The unraveling had started, but the deeper journey was still ahead. Because once the ego's grip loosens, even slightly, the world doesn't become easier, it becomes more real. And reality, in its raw form, doesn't care about the stories I used to hide behind. It doesn't care about the narratives I inherited or the comfortable illusions I once clung to. It simply presents itself in unfiltered clarity, and I was finally able to sense how much of my life had been an attempt to avoid that clarity. As I moved further into this uncovered territory of the mind, I began to notice the subtle tension between who I had been conditioned to be and who I was becoming. It felt like walking between two worlds, one built of predictable structures, the other woven from pure potential. The conditioned mind kept tugging at me, whispering old fears, reminding me of the expectations I was supposed to fulfill. But the deeper part of me, the newly awakened part, was no longer interested in performing. It wanted direct experience, direct perception, unmediated by cultural noise or psychological habit. I felt the layers continue to peel away, sometimes gently, sometimes like skin being torn from bone. Because self-discovery isn't a poetic unfolding. It's a confrontation with everything I've avoided. I started to see the emotional mechanisms I had carried for years, mechanisms designed not to protect me, but to keep me aligned with the collective script. Whenever I resisted certain truths, I realized the resistance wasn't coming from my authentic self. It was the ego tightening its grip, terrified of dissolving. This recognition created an unusual shift inside me. I no longer identified with the resistance. I observed it instead, watched it rise and fall like weather patterns in the psyche. And in observing it, I felt something powerful emerge, a sense that I was no longer the character in the story, but the awareness behind it. This didn't make me detached from life. It made me more present, more attuned, as if layers of fog were lifting from my vision. The more I embodied this presence, the more I realized how deeply the world trains us to fragment ourselves. We are taught to compartmentalize our thoughts, our desires, even our intuition. But the true self does not exist in fragments. It exists as a whole, a singular current of awareness moving through experience. I saw how my own fragmentation had been encouraged by societal systems that thrive on predictability. They want humans to think in straight lines, to stay within the boundaries of what's acceptable, to avoid the vastness of their own potential. But my mind was no longer interested in those boundaries. It had tasted something wider, something far more ancient than the modern world's idea of identity. As I wandered deeper into this internal shift, the external world began revealing new patterns. It wasn't that the chaos had disappeared, it was that I no longer perceived it through the lens of fear. I saw humanity scrambling for meaning, clinging to certainty in a rapidly changing landscape, trying desperately to maintain a sense of control. But control is the ego's last illusion, a fragile defense against the natural flux of existence. When that illusion collapses, what's left isn't destruction, it's possibility. I found myself observing the world with a sense of calm curiosity. Every conflict, every contradiction, every cultural tension began to look like a symptom of collective ego dissolution. The species is being pushed to evolve, to shed old paradigms, to awaken from narratives that have long overstayed their purpose. And as I recognized this, I felt less like an outsider and more like a participant in a planetary transformation. Not in a grandiose sense, but in a deeply human one, as if my personal awakening was quietly woven into the larger evolution of consciousness. As that realization deepened, something remarkable happened. The fear of uncertainty vanished. Not because the unknown became less mysterious, but because I stopped expecting it to conform to my expectations. I let the unknown be unknown. I let mystery hold its place. And in doing so, I felt the mind loosen, stretch, expand. The boundaries that once defined me began dissolving, not into chaos, but into a kind of spacious awareness that felt profoundly natural. This shift also revealed how much of my previous life had been lived in reaction. Reaction to praise, reaction to criticism, reaction to cultural narratives, reaction to the ego's constant demands. But when reaction fades, something extraordinary emerges, authentic response. A response born not from conditioning but from clarity. It is quieter, slower, and infinitely more powerful. It doesn't seek validation. It doesn't chase certainty. It simply moves from truth. As I lived from this place, the world around me felt different, not because it changed, but because I finally encountered it without distortion. Simple moments, a breeze through trees, the sound of distant traffic, the faint hum of electricity, took on a quality of aliveness. I realized how much I had missed in my previous state of distraction, how many moments had passed unnoticed because the ego was too busy reinforcing its own story. Without that constant reinforcement, I could finally feel the texture of existence. It wasn't always comfortable. Sometimes the rawness of reality felt overwhelming. Without the buffer of illusion, emotions surfaced with surprising intensity, grief I hadn't processed, fear I hadn't acknowledged, desires I had suppressed. But even these emotions, once observed without attachment, transformed into clarity. They were not obstacles, they were remnants of old identities dissolving, and with every dissolution, my perception sharpened. The journey took on a rhythm. Illusions surfaced, dissolved, resurfaced, dissolved again. I watched the process with the same curious awareness that had been growing inside me. The ego never disappears completely, but it becomes transparent, visible, manageable. It stops being a tyrant and becomes a tool, something I can use without being controlled by it. And in that shift, I found a freedom that no external achievement had ever given me. The deeper I traveled into this internal restructuring, the more intuitive my perception became. I started sensing the subtext behind people's words, the energy beneath their actions. Not in a mystical sense, but in a profoundly human one. When the noise of ego quiets, empathy becomes natural, understanding becomes effortless. I stopped interpreting people through stereotypes or judgments and began sensing their own entanglement in collective illusions. And compassion began rising within me, not as a moral choice, but as a natural response to awareness. This compassion extended toward myself as well. I no longer resented my past self for being trapped in narratives. I understood that I was simply repeating the patterns of the world around me. And when I saw this clearly, forgiveness came easily, not because I had done something wrong, but because I had finally seen the machinery behind my own behavior. I understood the roots of my conditioning, and in understanding them, I was no longer bound by them. As this internal shift stabilized, something profound opened within me, a sense of interconnectedness not based on ideology, but on direct perception. I began to feel the world as a unified field of experience. The boundaries between self and other, between internal and external, began to blur, not in a dissolving of identity, but in an expansion of perspective. I could still say but that had grown spacious, less confined, less isolated. It was as if the self had become a window instead of a wall. In this expanded state, creativity flourished, ideas flowed without effort, insights arrived without searching, clarity became a natural byproduct of presence. I realized that the true self doesn't need to force anything. It doesn't need to strive. Its nature is inherently expressive, and when the egoic filters fall away, that expression becomes fluid, precise, alive. The world, once overwhelming, began to feel like a canvas instead of a battlefield. Not because the chaos disappeared, but because I had stopped internalizing it. I saw patterns emerging from the noise, opportunities emerging from challenges, insights emerging from uncertainty. Everything became information, and information became insight, and insight became liberation. The deeper I went, the more apparent it became that the true self is not something distant or mystical. It is the most natural part of us, the part that has always been present beneath the layers of conditioning. It doesn't demand attention, it simply waits for the noise to settle. And in the quiet, it reveals itself with a clarity so profound that even the most chaotic world cannot obscure it. The path continued, opening further, drawing me into depths I had never imagined. The path continued, opening further, drawing me into depths I had never imagined. As if every step forward revealed another hidden chamber of my own awareness. There was no destination, no final revelation waiting for me. Instead, there was an ongoing expansion, a widening of perception that made ordinary reality feel both more mysterious and more intimate. The boundaries I had once taken as absolute were dissolving into a fluid landscape of possibilities, and I could feel myself shifting in ways that were subtle yet irreversible. It was as though I had spent my entire life in a dimly lit room, and now someone had quietly opened a window, letting in a brilliance that made everything previously known appear incomplete. I began to sense reality not as a fixed structure, but as something alive, something responsive, something that changed as my awareness changed. The external world no longer felt separate from my internal transformation. Instead, it mirrored it. The more I freed myself from the constraints of inherited identity, the more the world revealed its own fluid nature. Even the simplest experiences, the movement of shadows across a wall, the rhythm of my own breath, the shifting patterns of human behavior, seemed to carry messages I had always been too distracted to notice. It was as if the universe had always been speaking, but only now was I capable of hearing its subtler language. As this shift deepened, I became acutely aware of how much of human suffering stems not from circumstance, but from misunderstanding, not from what happens to us, but from the stories we tell ourselves about what happens. These stories are woven from the threads of ego, from the collective assumptions passed down through generations. They become invisible maps we follow without questioning, maps drawn by others, maps designed for a world that no longer exists. And I saw how many people are trapped in these false maps, wandering aimlessly through landscapes that could never lead them to authentic fulfillment. In this realization, I felt a responsibility forming within me, not imposed, not born of guilt, but emerging naturally from clarity. I understood that self-discovery is not a private luxury, it is a contribution to the collective evolution of consciousness. Each person who breaks free from illusion widens the doorway for others, shifts the collective frequency, even if only by a fraction. And as I recognized my own unfolding in this context, I felt my purpose beginning to crystallize not as a mission, but as a natural expression of awareness. My transformation was not separate from the world's transformation. It was a small but integral part of it. The deeper I went, the more the internal landscape transformed. Thoughts became less like commands and more like passing clouds. Emotions no longer pulled me into their storms, but rose and dissolved with a kind of graceful inevitability. And beneath them all, there was a steady presence, an unshakable stillness that had always been there. This presence was not something I had achieved, it was something I had uncovered. It had been buried under layers of noise, distraction, fear, and inherited expectations. Now, with the layers peeling away, it revealed itself as the quiet core of my being. This presence changed the way I moved through the world. It changed the way I listened, the way I spoke, the way I interpreted reality. I found myself less reactive, more deliberate, more attuned. I sensed patterns behind people's actions that I had never noticed before, patterns rooted in fear, in longing, in unresolved narratives. And instead of feeling irritated or overwhelmed by others, I felt a deeper understanding. Not a detached pity, but a recognition. They were entangled in the same collective illusions I had been entangled in. Their behavior made sense when viewed through the lens of their conditioning, and this recognition dissolved judgment, replacing it with something quieter and far more liberating. At the same time, I began noticing how the collective ego expresses itself not only through individuals, but through systems, institutions, and cultures. It forms structures that seem stable but are actually fragile, built on outdated assumptions about what humans are and what they need. These structures cling to power not out of malice, but out of fear, fear of irrelevance, fear of change, fear of losing the illusion of control. And as the world accelerates, as information spreads faster than narratives can adapt, these structures begin to fracture. The chaos we see globally is not random. It is the cracking of old shells that can no longer contain the evolution occurring within the human psyche. In observing all this, I felt a strange mix of calm and urgency. Calm because I understood the necessity of this dissolution. Urgency because I sensed how many people might mistake this pivotal moment for darkness rather than transformation. It's easy to see the world unraveling and assume collapse. But often, collapse is simply the first stage of renewal. Life has always evolved through cycles of destruction and rebirth, and right now, humanity stands at the threshold of shedding a collective identity that no longer serves its growth. I felt myself embodying this shedding more deeply with each passing day. The old identities that had once defined me felt distant, almost like memories of another lifetime. I could still recall them, but they no longer held emotional weight. They no longer dictated my choices or limited my perception. Instead, they floated behind me like shadows, reminders of how much of my life had been governed by invisible narratives. And as they faded, I stepped more fully into the clarity that had been waiting beneath them. This clarity brought with it a sense of inner spaciousness. It was not emptiness, but room for new insights, new experiences, new ways of being. It was as if I had been living in a cluttered house and, without realizing it, had begun clearing the rooms one by one. And now, standing in the open space, I felt the potential of what could unfold. Not what should unfold, not what must unfold, but what can unfold when the mind is no longer imprisoned by conditioned assumptions. The deeper I sank into this spaciousness, the more attuned I became to intuition. Not intuition as a mystical voice, but as a natural intelligence arising from unfiltered perception. It guided me not with certainty, but with clarity. Certainty is rigid, shaped by ego. Clarity is fluid, shaped by awareness. And I found myself trusting this clarity more than any belief or thought. It wasn't irrational, it was the most rational state I had ever experienced, because it aligned directly with reality rather than the stories wrapped around reality. As this alignment deepened, fear lost its grip. Not because I became fearless, but because fear transformed into information. It ceased to be a barrier and became a signal. It indicated where illusions still remained, where attachments still held power, where the ego was still clinging to outdated narratives. And as I observed these signals without judgment, they dissolved naturally like mist evaporating under sunlight. Each dissolution brought another layer of perception into focus. I began noticing the interconnectedness between inner states and external experience. When my awareness expanded, life seemed to expand with it. When I released internal tension, situations around me seemed to soften. Not because I was controlling reality, but because my perception no longer distorted it. The world had always been open, always been alive, always been layered with possibility. I had simply been too entangled in my own egoic fog to see it clearly. This newfound clarity created a kind of emotional resilience that felt unbreakable. Not a hardened resilience, but one rooted in understanding. Challenges no longer felt like threats to my identity. They felt like opportunities to deepen my awareness. Situations that once triggered frustration now revealed hidden dimensions. Every moment, pleasant or difficult, became part of a larger unfolding, part of a transformation that extended beyond my personal narrative. The farther I traveled inward, the more I realized that the true self is not discovered through striving or achievement. It emerges naturally when illusions fall away. It is revealed in silence, in presence, in the moments when the mind stops performing. And as I lived in this expanding state, I could feel a subtle but powerful shift. I was not becoming someone new. I was returning to something ancient, something original, something that had been waiting beneath the noise of the world and the noise within myself. And with each passing moment, the path continued to widen, drawing me further into the depths of awareness, deeper into the essence of what I had always been beneath the illusions I had once mistaken for reality. And with each passing moment, the path continued to widen, drawing me further into the depths of awareness, deeper into the essence of what I had always been beneath the illusions I had once mistaken for reality. I could feel something shifting at the very edges of perception, as though the boundaries that had defined my identity were dissolving into a vast field of presence. It wasn't an escape from the world, it was an immersion into it, an immersion so complete that the separation between observer and observed began to blur into a seamless continuum of experience. As this unfolding intensified, I realized that I had spent most of my life trying to hold the world together through sheer force of belief. I believed in myself, I believed in my story, I believed in the structures around me, and I believed in the systems that shaped my thought. But belief is fragile when it rests on assumptions, when it's built on borrowed narratives instead of direct experience. And as these borrowed narratives disintegrated, I felt the weight of belief lift. What replaced it was not disbelief, but a state of knowing, not intellectual knowing, not conceptual certainty, but a knowing that arises from direct contact with existence itself. This knowing didn't give me answers, it gave me clarity. It didn't give me certainty, it gave me presence. And in that presence, I could finally see the world not as a chaotic battlefield, but as a living organism, complex, interconnected, constantly evolving. I noticed how every event, no matter how random it appeared on the surface, was woven into a much larger tapestry. Patterns emerged where I had once seen only disorder. Meaning surfaced where I had once seen only confusion. And for the first time, I felt integrated not just within myself, but within the unfolding story of existence. There was a profound stillness at the center of this realization, a stillness that felt both ancient and new. It was the stillness of awareness observing itself, of consciousness recognizing its own depth. And from that stillness, I began to understand something transformative. The world doesn't become peaceful when chaos disappears. The world becomes peaceful when I stop resisting what is. Resistance was the source of my suffering. Clinging was the source of my confusion. The moment I stopped wrestling with reality, reality began to reveal its deeper order. This shift allowed me to see my past with new eyes. Every mistake, every failure, every fear that had once weighed heavily on me now appeared as necessary steps in a larger unfolding. They weren't obstacles, they were catalysts. They forced me into awareness. They pushed me into depth. They guided me toward a truth I had been avoiding, that the self I had been defending all these years was never real. It was a narrative built on fears, longings, and assumptions passed down by a culture that feared its own depth. As I released this narrative, I felt an immense liberation, like stepping out of a prison I hadn't realized I was in. The bars were invisible, made of expectations and cultural conditioning, but they had been just as confining. And now, standing outside them, I could finally breathe in the fullness of my own existence. Not the existence I had inherited, not the existence I had been taught to accept, but the existence that arises directly from consciousness itself. With this liberation came an unexpected revelation: the ego isn't an enemy, it's a tool. It becomes dangerous only when it believes it is the whole of who we are. When the ego pretends to be the self, it becomes a tyrant, constantly seeking validation, constantly fearing annihilation. But when it's seen clearly, when it's placed back in its proper role, it becomes a servant, a necessary interface between the infinite awareness within and the finite world outside. And understanding this changed everything. My relationship with my own mind softened. The inner struggle dissolved. I stopped trying to destroy the ego and started learning how to work with it. This marked the beginning of a new kind of inner coherence. Instead of being pulled in a dozen different directions by unconscious beliefs and emotional impulses, I felt unified, centered, grounded. I wasn't hiding from myself anymore. I wasn't performing for the world. I wasn't trying to maintain an image. I was simply present, deeply, fully, and unmistakably present. And in that presence, I discovered an intelligence far greater than anything the rational mind could produce. It wasn't intellectual intelligence, it was intuitive intelligence. It flowed effortlessly, without strain, without hesitation. It guided me in ways I could not rationally explain, but could immediately recognize as true. It was the same intelligence that governs nature, the same intelligence that orchestrates the unfolding of galaxies and the blooming of flowers. It had always been within me, but it had been drowned out by the noise of societal expectations. Now, as the noise faded, this deeper intelligence emerged with unmistakable clarity. I found myself acting not from fear or habit, but from alignment. Every decision became an expression of awareness. Every step became intentional. Life stopped feeling like something happening to me and became something happening through me. I wasn't directing it, I was participating in it. I wasn't controlling it, I was flowing with it. And the more I surrendered to this flow, the more effortless everything became. This effortless state didn't mean life became easy. Challenges still arose. Uncertainties still appeared. Unpredictability still ruled the external world. But the difference was that I no longer interpreted these events through the lens of insecurity. Instead, I saw them as part of the larger movement, the dynamic unfolding that consciousness uses to grow, to evolve, to express itself. And because I no longer resisted this movement, I found myself navigating life with a kind of calm confidence that felt deeply natural. This inner transformation also changed the way I connected with others. I no longer saw people as separate from me. Their fears, desires, and struggles mirrored my own journey. Their illusions were reflections of illusions I had once held. The more I recognized this, the harder it became to judge them. Compassion rose spontaneously, not as a moral obligation, but as a natural expression of understanding. It became clear that every person is doing the best they can with the awareness they have, and when awareness expands, their actions naturally shift. In this recognition, connection became deeper. Conversations became more meaningful. Human interaction became an exchange of awareness rather than a clash of egos. I stopped needing to be right, stopped needing to win, stopped needing to defend anything. There was nothing left to defend. When the self is rooted in awareness instead of identity, it becomes unshakable. Criticism loses its sting. Praise loses its lure. Approval loses its importance. What matters instead is authenticity, authentic presence, authentic expression, authentic connection. As this authenticity solidified, I began to sense the magnitude of the transformation taking place not just within me, but within humanity itself. We are living in a time when old systems are cracking, old beliefs are dissolving, and old identities are collapsing. The collective ego is facing itself, confronting its own illusions, and feeling the tremors of its own unraveling. Many interpret this as chaos, as decline, as the end of stability. But from the vantage point of awareness, it looks like the necessary shedding of outdated structures, an evolutionary pressure pushing humanity toward a higher level of consciousness. I could feel myself becoming part of this shift, not as a spectator, but as an active participant. My personal awakening was not separate from the world's awakening. It was a microcosm of the same process. And this realization filled me with a sense of purpose, not a purpose rooted in ambition, but a purpose rooted in clarity. The purpose of simply being awake in a world that is learning how to awaken. The purpose of embodying awareness in a world where awareness is becoming essential for survival. As I lived more fully from this awareness, something profound began to emerge, a sense of inner completion. Not the completion of a journey, but the completion of a cycle. The self I had been unraveling, observing, and transforming was no longer the center of my reality. Awareness had taken its place. And in this awareness, I found a kind of peace that wasn't dependent on circumstances. It wasn't fragile, it wasn't conditional. It was simply there, unshakable, constant, alive. This peace didn't remove me from the world, it rooted me more deeply within it. I no longer saw life as something to conquer, but as something to experience fully. I no longer sought meaning. I created it through my presence. I no longer tried to escape uncertainty. I embraced it as the natural environment of consciousness. And in this embrace, I discovered that uncertainty isn't something to fear. It's the birthplace of possibility. It's the space where transformation occurs. It's the field in which the true self reveals itself. The more I lived in this space, the more I understood that awakening is not a destination. It is a continual process. Every moment presents a new opportunity to shade illusion, to deepen awareness, to expand beyond the limitations of identity. There is no end point, no final enlightenment, no ultimate realization that closes the path. The path is infinite because consciousness is infinite. And the deeper I walked into this infinity, the more vast and intimate existence became. This brought me to the final understanding that crystallized at the core of my journey: authenticity is the only foundation on which a meaningful life can be built. Everything else is temporary. Everything else is fragile. Everything else eventually collapses. But authenticity, the direct expression of awareness through a human life, remains steady through every storm. It adapts, it flows, it evolves, but it never loses itself. It is the thread of truth that weaves through every moment, connecting the finite with the infinite, the personal with the cosmic. And as this realization settled into me, I felt the entire journey, from confusion to clarity, from ego to awareness, from fragmentation to wholeness, come together into a single truth. The true self is not something I discover. It is something I become by shedding everything I am not. And in becoming it, I align with the deeper intelligence of existence itself, stepping into a way of living that is not only free, but profoundly alive.